Morality's a fairy tale for fools. I learned that the hard way. I'm a teacher who entered an elite prep school. Eyes bright with ideals. Believing talent and honesty would crown me. Wrong. Glossy halls. Perfect smiles hid a snake pit success. Wasn't skill, but deception. At an awards night, I sat back, fists clenched, watching a nobody steal my applause. His smug grin stabbed me, waking a dark force. Alone in my classroom, I stared at a fair but useless gradebook. Pen hovering, heart pounding. I changed a grade, then more. Each stroke colder, no guilt, just power. A big shot parent's thank you note praised my insight. A boosted kid beamed. Clueless. I knew this wasn't wrong. It was survival. Fairness is for losers. Perception beats truth. Ambition devours integrity. I stopped playing nice. Morality is a bedtime story for the weak. I learned that the hard way. I still vividly recall the suffocating pressure of those early years at Woodrow Prep, where the line between ambition and desperation blurred each passing day. Everyone admired our elegant classrooms, polished marble floors, and impeccably dressed staff. But beneath the glittering surface lay an unspoken rule. Success had little to do with teaching excellence, and everything to do with perception. I began teaching mathematics there with genuine enthusiasm, confident in my talent and integrity. But soon, reality tore through that illusion. I remember clearly the first award ceremony I attended, seated unnoticed in the shadowy back rows, gripping my hands tightly as applause filled the auditorium, not for me, but for Richard Ellis, a colleague notoriously mediocre in talent, yet exceptional in connections. That moment of applause felt like a sharp blade sliding between my ribs. Richard winked at me from the stage, his expression dripping smug triumph, and something inside me hardened permanently. Weeks later, alone in my classroom after sunset, the silence punctuated only by distant footsteps down empty hallways. I flipped through the gradebook. Perfectly fair scores stared back at me. Neat, honest, and useless. My hand trembled slightly as I picked up the pen. A chill crawled down my spine, my breathing quickening as if about to cross a forbidden line. Yet, oddly enough, the hesitation dissolved swiftly as the pen touched paper, like breaking through thin ice into freezing water. I raised one student's grade from a B- to a confident A, then another, and another, with each stroke of the pen. My heart slowed, tension easing into calm assurance. When I finished, I stared at the altered numbers. Surprisingly, no guilt, no shame flooded me, only relief and a sense of justified entitlement. The next day, a neatly typed letter landed softly on my desk, the elegant stationery bearing the signature of a prominent parent. "Thank you, Mr. Stanton," it read, "for believing in my son's potential." At lunch, the student himself approached me, eyes shining with newfound confidence, unaware of the secret behind his improved performance. In that instant, I felt certain there was no wrongdoing here, only adaptation. It was survival, not sin. After all, morality was merely a luxury for those unwilling or incapable of doing what must be done to succeed. I walked the polished corridors of Woodrow Prep each morning like a quiet king, surveying his kingdom. My shoes echoed softly against the marble floors, resonating with the unspoken respect of everyone I passed. Students offered polite nods, their eyes shining with admiration, and colleagues greeted me warmly, eager for a word of advice, or even just a passing acknowledgement. Each interaction reinforced the carefully constructed image I had spent decades perfecting. My classroom, elegantly adorned with awards and framed testimonials from prestigious universities, became the subtle yet powerful proof of my standing. Parents waited patiently after school conferences, hoping to secure just a few precious minutes with me. They'd smile warmly, offering grateful words like, "We're truly lucky our daughter has you guiding her, Mr. Stanton," unaware of the ironies behind their gratitude. Even Principal Harris, a man known for his stern, aloof manner, always greeted me with respectful warmth. During weekly meetings, my opinion was sought first and considered final. Whenever tensions rose in faculty discussions, it was invariably my measured voice, calm and authoritative, that restored order. This reputation wasn't built on idealism. It rested firmly on my meticulous ability to adapt and influence every scenario to my advantage. Standing before an assembly one bright spring morning, receiving yet another accolade as applause thundered through the hall, I felt no guilt or uncertainty, only the calm assurance of a man who understood precisely how the world operated. As the claps faded and the students rose to their feet, cheering enthusiastically, I allowed myself a small smile. After all, this was proof that success had nothing to do with playing fair, and everything to do with playing smart. Returning to my office afterward, I passed by the teacher's lounge, where quiet conversations paused respectfully as I entered. Younger colleagues discreetly straightened their postures, subtly rearranging themselves to project professionalism in my presence. I nodded slightly, acknowledging them briefly, yet purposefully, savoring the silent power in their responses. Such gestures weren't trivial. They affirmed my status clearly. Every day, at my desk, I carefully straightened a small stack of letters, each handwritten with careful precision notes of appreciation from former students now thriving in elite colleges. I skimmed their heartfelt words, admiring how thoroughly my influence had shaped their paths. These messages never failed to reassure me that my choices, no matter how morally questionable some might consider them, had ultimately propelled countless futures forward. Outside the window, the perfectly manicured lawns stretched peacefully under the sunlight. Everything here, each brick, each polished pane of glass, each carefully maintained hedge, reflected my meticulous standards. I leaned back, contentedly tracing the polished wood grain of my desk with a fingertip. Breathing in the quiet authority of my environment, a distant laugh drifted through the corridor, briefly disrupting the silence before fading away. In that fleeting interruption, a single thought echoed calmly through my mind. True morality, I mused, wasn't about adhering blindly to virtue. It was about controlling perceptions and outcomes. And in that delicate art, I was nothing short of a master. Ethan Reed arrived at Woodrow Prep on a crisp autumn morning, his energy immediately noticeable, like a jolt of fresh air slicing through the stale routine. Standing by the faculty lounge, I quietly observed as he introduced himself to the staff. Dressed casually, yet deliberately in a blazer over a light sweater, comfortable, approachable. Exactly the sort of look young idealists favored. His dark, tousled hair gave him a youthful charm, complemented by his wide, earnest smile and piercingly sincere eyes that seemed to search for connections in every face he encountered. Within moments, Ethan had effortlessly gathered a small crowd. He spoke with lively gestures, enthusiasm pouring freely into his every word. I caught fragments of his conversation, phrases like real connections, genuine engagement, and the importance of trust. I leaned against the doorway, crossing my arms tightly over my chest, swallowing my disdain. How easily people were seduced by empty promises, wrapped neatly in idealistic platitudes. Just as I was about to step away unnoticed, Ethan turned abruptly, meeting my eyes directly. With disarming warmth, he strode confidently towards me, extending his hand. "You must be Mr. Stanton," he said earnestly, his grip firm, yet polite. "I've heard so much about your accomplishments, it's truly inspiring." I smiled thinly, maintaining professional courtesy, while my mind silently mocked his earnest flattery. "Welcome to Woodrow," I replied smoothly, careful to conceal any hint of my inner cynicism. "You'll soon find that inspiration is the least of our concerns here." If he detected my sarcasm, Ethan showed no sign. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, eyes sparkling with naive determination. "I hope I can bring something valuable to the table, something authentic." Schools like ours could always use more honesty. Don't you think? I bit back a retort, nodding slowly with forced agreement. Certainly. Honesty has its place, I answered, inwardly irritated by his transparent idealism. As he returned to his admirers, my eyes narrowed with quiet annoyance. Later that afternoon, while walking quietly toward the main office, I overheard Susan Carter, a usually reserved colleague, enthusiastically telling another teacher, "He's exactly what this place needs. Fresh ideas. Genuine character. Ethan might actually change things around here." My jaw clenched involuntarily at her words. Something bitter twisted sharply in my stomach. Change was precisely what Woodrow Prep and I myself did not need. That evening, as twilight cast muted shadows across my empty classroom, I stood silently by the window, replaying our earlier exchange, despite my outward composure. A faint discomfort tugged persistently at the edges of my confidence. Ethan Reed might have seemed harmlessly idealistic at first glance. Yet, there was something unsettlingly sincere about him, something I couldn't easily dismiss. I had learned long ago that true threats rarely announce themselves loudly. Instead, they smiled warmly, shook hands politely, and quietly, methodically undermined everything you'd built, shaking off the thought with deliberate effort. I turned away from the window, determined not to overthink the threat of a naive idealist. But even as I switched off the lights and closed the door behind me, a quiet voice whispered uncomfortably in my mind, warning that perhaps Ethan Reed was more dangerous than he appeared. About 2 months after Ethan arrived at Woodrow Prep, I began to settle into the irritating but seemingly harmless presence he had established. He remained popular, but I assured myself that his idealism would inevitably shatter against the cold, unyielding wall of reality. It was this assurance that allowed me to remain comfortably in control, convinced everything was safely within my grasp. One late afternoon, long after most teachers had left the building, I sat alone in my office, carefully finalizing the semester reports for Principal Harris. Golden sunlight streamed through the window, casting a serene, amber glow across my quiet room, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Suddenly, there came a gentle knock at my door, pulling me sharply from my thoughts. "Come in," I called, not looking up, still focused on finishing my last few notes. The door opened quietly, and Ethan stepped inside, holding a neat stack of papers in his hands. I noticed immediately the unusually serious expression on his face. My heart skipped uncomfortably, suddenly beating faster. I placed the pen gently down, leaning back in my chair, forcing myself to maintain an outwardly calm facade. "Mr. Stanton," Ethan said cautiously, his voice low and serious. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" I hesitated for a second, swiftly brushing aside my growing unease, and gestured to the chair opposite mine. "Certainly. What can I help you with?" Ethan sat down, placing the documents carefully on my desk, his eyes meeting mine with uncomfortable directness. Tinged with hesitation, "I have been reviewing the midterm grades for the advanced senior class. I noticed something peculiar." He flipped quickly to a marked page, pointing at a name with a slender finger. "For example, Jacob Miller. I taught him English last semester. I know him fairly well. He's a good student, but the math grades he recently received seem unusually high compared to his actual performance." I immediately recalled the night I'd quietly adjusted Jacob's grades from a solid B to an impressive A+, a quick and decisive stroke of my pen. An involuntary rush of tension gripped me, my palms growing slightly damp beneath the desk. I tightened my fists subtly, determined not to let my nervousness show. "So, are you implying there's been some sort of mistake?" I asked evenly, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "I'm not entirely sure," Ethan replied, his tone still polite but laced with suspicion. "Since you're the teacher responsible for entering these grades, I thought you'd be the best person to clarify it." I paused, briefly, irritation rising sharply in my chest. Suddenly, Memories of my early career moments of bitter competition and humiliating scrutiny flashed vividly in my mind. I couldn't allow Ethan to push me back into a position of vulnerability. I forced a subtle smile, meeting Ethan's gaze with icy calm. Perhaps you haven't been here long enough to fully understand how things operate. At Woodrow Prep, we prioritize our students' futures above everything. Numbers alone often don't reflect a student's true potential. It's our duty as educators to look beyond them. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise, clearly taken aback. So, are you saying these grades were intentionally adjusted? I didn't say that. I swiftly countered, leaning forward, pinning him with a cold, sharp stare. I'm merely advising caution before making accusations or conclusions. Consider the consequences carefully. Reputations at Woodrow are fragile, especially for someone relatively new. Ethan remained silent for a few tense seconds, his expression shifting from shock to deep disappointment. Quietly, he rose from the chair and began gathering his documents. Before exiting, he paused at the doorway and turned, looking at me with an unforgettable expression of disappointment mixed with determination. I've always believed in honesty, Mr. Stanton, he said softly, yet firmly. I sincerely hope this school believes in it, too. He closed the door gently behind him, the soft click echoing loudly in my mind. Alone again, surrounded by lengthening shadows. I felt a surge of unease, my heart thudding heavily. Ethan had crossed a boundary he should never have approached. I knew, without doubt, that this small crack he had just opened could not simply be ignored. I could no longer pretend he was harmless. It was clear now Ethan Reed was becoming a threat that demanded my serious attention. The atmosphere at Woodrow Prep had subtly shifted since Ethan's quiet accusation. Like the uneasy stillness before a storm finally breaks, several days passed without further incident. Yet a silent, underlying tension remained. I had expected Ethan to retreat, to realize his mistake, reconsider, even apologize, but he surprised me by returning, more determined than ever. It was late afternoon when Ethan appeared in the doorway of my classroom once again. The final bell had just rung, students dispersing quickly through the corridors. Oblivious to the brewing conflict, Ethan stepped inside without waiting for my invitation, firmly closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch echoed quietly, sealing us into sudden isolation. Mr. Stanton, Ethan began, his voice carefully controlled. Yet I noticed his hand gripping the edge of his papers a bit too tightly, betraying hidden nervousness. I need to speak with you again. I set down the stack of tests I'd been grading, carefully aligning their edges with forced calmness. Despite my outward composure, I felt an involuntary tightening in my jaw, the faint pulsing of anger rising to my temples. Ethan, I responded coolly. Is there really anything left to discuss? Yes, there is. Ethan pressed forward, maintaining eye contact, though his voice trembled slightly. I've double-checked every record. Jacob Miller's grades and several others are unquestionably inflated. I'm not here to accuse blindly, but I cannot ignore what I've seen. For a fleeting moment, my breath slowed sharply, the air around me suddenly thickening. The mention of Jacob's name brought back a vivid image of my pen methodically changing that B into an A+, each deliberate stroke now feeling dangerously exposed. Forcing myself to remain composed, I raised an eyebrow mockingly. And what exactly do you hope to accomplish by pursuing this? I asked, my tone intentionally patronizing. Do you truly believe your moral crusade will change the reality here? Ethan took a cautious step closer, his shoulders squared, his eyes bright with stubborn idealism. I believe honesty matters, he insisted quietly. Integrity matters. Maybe you've forgotten that over the years, but some of us haven't. His words sliced through my carefully crafted facade, sparking a brief flashback, memories of my early teaching days, when I'd once trusted that honesty alone could carry me forward, only to watch colleagues manipulate the system and surpass me. Laughing quietly behind my back, my hand curled slowly into a fist beneath the desk, knuckles whitening. Though I kept my voice icy calm. Integrity, I echoed bitterly. Integrity is a convenient ideal until you learn how easily it betrays you. You're naive, Ethan. Dangerously naive. Your youthful optimism blinds you to the simple truth this world isn't governed by virtue. It thrives on perception, power, and influence. Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes never wavering, though I could see the strain etched deeply across his face. Maybe that's true, he replied firmly, but someone has to stand up for what's right. I won't turn away from this. I rose deliberately from my chair, the quiet scraping sound of wood against tile floors accentuating my slow, purposeful movements. Standing slightly taller than Ethan, I fixed him with a penetrating glare, deliberately stepping into his personal space. Then, listen carefully, I warned in a low, steely voice. Careers and reputations are fragile here. You might think you're noble for challenging this, but I promise you, your idealism won't shield you from reality. It will ruin you. A brief hesitation flickered in Ethan's eyes, the first small sign of fear, yet he refused to yield, straightening his shoulders defiantly. If my career here depends on accepting dishonesty, then it isn't worth protecting. Without waiting for my response, Ethan spun abruptly, swiftly opening the door and stepping back into the hallway. The soft echo of his footsteps receded, leaving behind a tense silence, filled only by my uneven breathing. Alone again, my heart hammered uncomfortably in my chest. Ethan had drawn his line. There was no retreating now. Anger simmered beneath my surface calm, mingled with a sharp sense of threat that I'd underestimated until this moment. I unclenched my fist slowly, realizing the battle lines were now unmistakably clear. Ethan Reed wasn't just a naive inconvenience. He declared himself an enemy, and I knew better than anyone that in wars of perception and power, there could be only one victor. I had anticipated Ethan's next move clearly. It was inevitable he'd escalate his idealistic crusade straight to the administration, following our tense confrontation. It was simply a matter of time. Yet, I felt no anxiety, no fear, just quiet confidence. After all, I had spent years carefully nurturing my influence within these walls, and this scenario was precisely one I had prepared for. 2 days later, I stood unnoticed by the partially open doorway of the meeting room, quietly observing Ethan outside Principal Harris's office. Ethan paced anxiously, his fingers clutching tightly at the edges of a thick folder filled with evidence. From my vantage point, I noted how he occasionally adjusted his tie nervously, and the slight sheen of sweat forming at his temples. My lips curled subtly into a faint, amused smile. When Harris finally emerged, Ethan approached quickly, launching immediately into a passionate, earnest explanation from afar. I couldn't hear their exact words, but the scene itself spoke clearly enough. Ethan, animated yet vulnerable. Harris, arms crossed, face a mask of patient indifference. Behind the principal, I caught glimpses of Vice Principal Andrews and Department Head Margaret Collins, exchanging brief, meaningful glances, careful nods of mutual understanding that only reinforced my certainty. Ethan finished his plea and handed Harris the thick folder. Harris barely glanced at the documents, then shook his head slowly, calmly. Ethan's eyes widened, confusion clearly written across his face. Harris placed a fatherly hand gently on Ethan's shoulder, mouthing words I could easily guess. We must think of the school's reputation first. The principal's tone was patient, sympathetic but completely uncompromising. As Harris turned away, dismissing Ethan's concerns, Ethan's grip weakened abruptly. A few loose pages slipped quietly from his folder, scattering awkwardly across the polished hallway floor. He quickly bent down, hastily gathering the scattered papers, cheeks flushed with embarrassment and frustration, watching his hurried movements. I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction ripple warmly through my chest. As Ethan stood up, visibly shaken, he turned and suddenly saw me standing there, Our eyes met across the empty corridor, and in that instant, all pretense vanished. His expression hardened into bitter realization as I allowed a faint smile of triumph to cross my lips. Ethan approached me, his voice low and strained with barely contained anger. "You knew," he whispered accusingly, eyes sharp with disgust. "You knew exactly how they'd react, didn't you?" "Of course," I replied calmly, softly. "You're too inexperienced." "Ethan, idealism blinds you to how things really operate. Integrity matters here only until it threatens stability. Your noble principles, unfortunately, have no place in practical reality." His shoulders slumped slightly, eyes darting away in disbelief. "I thought at least Harris would care about the truth," he muttered bitterly. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice to a harsh whisper. "Truth, Ethan. The truth is often inconvenient. Loyalty, discretion, and reputation. Those are the only currencies that truly matter at Woodrow Prep." "You've chosen the wrong battle." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He turned abruptly, clutching his folder tightly, and walked away, his steps now heavy with defeat. Watching him disappear down the corridor, I stood silently for a moment, savoring the quiet victory. I glanced toward Harris's office, noting the calm conversations inside, administrators casually resuming their work as if Ethan's accusations had been nothing more than a minor distraction. Straightening my jacket, I walked slowly back toward my office, my pulse calm, steady, satisfied. Ethan had badly misunderstood the nature of power. He had assumed morality and honesty were strong enough weapons to prevail. He had grossly underestimated the strength of pragmatism and the careful alliances I had painstakingly built. I now felt a deeper certainty than ever before. Ethan Reed's crusade was effectively over, and mine, my carefully constructed world, was stronger than ever. In the days following Ethan's failed attempt to raise his accusations with the administration, I clearly observed the shift in how colleagues treated him. Faculty meetings, once filled with warmth and easy laughter, became noticeably colder whenever Ethan entered. Teachers who had previously welcomed him into conversations now discreetly shortened discussions or excused themselves abruptly when he approached, as if his very presence had suddenly become toxic. I quietly enjoyed watching this unfold, often standing inconspicuously in a corner of the staff room, observing Ethan's growing isolation. I could see the confusion and quiet pain etched on his face, each time his attempts at conversation were met with polite, yet distant responses. One afternoon, just after Ethan had left the staff room, I overheard Margaret Collins whisper anxiously to another colleague, "It's better to steer clear of him." Harris made it perfectly clear. No one wants to risk their careers by associating with him now. Margaret's words landed like the definitive punctuation mark, a clear sign that betrayal had come swiftly and decisively from the very people Ethan trusted most. Unable to hide my subtle satisfaction, I walked past them, feeling a quiet sense of triumph knowing my position at the school was now absolutely secure, backed fully by those in power. On another occasion, while passing the principal's office, I caught sight of Ethan waiting anxiously in the hallway for Principal Harris. This time, however, Harris simply acknowledged him with a curt, indifferent nod before quickly walking past, never slowing down, his expression blank as if Ethan were invisible. I watched Ethan's expression shift rapidly from surprise to hurt, and finally, to the bitter realization of betrayal. As Ethan turned to walk away, our eyes met briefly across the hallway. I held his gaze evenly, deliberately, cold, and triumphant, silently communicating my message. "You have nowhere left to go now, Ethan." He quickly looked away, shoulders visibly slumping in defeat as he moved off down the corridor. I turned calmly back to my office, closed the door quietly behind me, and allowed myself to savor the satisfying feeling of Ethan's isolation and helplessness. Settling comfortably into my chair, I leaned back and quietly enjoyed the wave of power and gratification washing over me. Ethan Reed had made a critical mistake. He had trusted his naive ideals, profoundly underestimating the real strength and influence I had so meticulously built. This world never belonged to idealists like Ethan. It belonged solely to those who adapted, manipulated, and wielded power wisely. And now, in this carefully orchestrated game, I was undoubtedly holding all the cards. I had never been one to rush my plans. My many years at Woodrow Prep taught me an invaluable lesson. True power comes from patience, subtlety, and meticulous control over even the smallest of details. A few days after Ethan's concerns had been brushed aside by the administration, I began to carefully execute my plan to completely reverse our roles. Late one afternoon, when the teacher's lounge had emptied, I deliberately sat down next to Margaret Collins. Feigning a troubled expression, eyebrows knitted as if conflicted, Margaret immediately noticed my demeanor, her head tilting slightly as she leaned in, her hand unconsciously moving to her mouth in concern. "Robert, is everything all right? What's wrong?" I released a soft sigh, appearing hesitant, then finally spoke. "I'm torn about mentioning this. Margaret, I certainly don't wish to stir up more trouble for Ethan, but recently I've heard some worrying things." Margaret instantly grew attentive, curiosity mingled with anxiety in her eyes. "What have you heard?" I leaned in closer, lowering my voice to a confidential whisper. "You know, Ethan, he's enthusiastic, idealistic, but he can also be quite extreme. Recently, I contacted a former colleague of his. Apparently, Ethan caused a similar disruption at his previous school, stirring a scandal and then quietly leaving. I'm concerned his true motivations might not be as noble as he claims." Margaret's eyes widened in surprise, her hand instinctively rising to her chest as if struggling to believe what she'd just heard. "Is it really that serious? Why haven't I heard anything before?" "Of course," I replied quietly, shaking my head slowly in apparent regret. "No one wants to revisit old scandals. Still, I think it's wise to be cautious, considering the school's reputation." Margaret nodded thoughtfully, clearly troubled yet accepting my words without question. I knew she wouldn't keep this information quiet for long. Sure enough, the very next morning, as I walked through the hallway, I overheard Susan Carter discreetly whispering to a parent. "I've heard Ethan has caused trouble like this before. Some even say he's deliberately undermining the school's reputation." I walked past them, feigning disinterest, but inwardly savoring how swiftly and effectively my seeds of doubt had spread. Within days, Ethan transformed from a respected, idealistic young teacher into the target of suspicion and mistrust. One crisp morning, I stood beside my office window, observing Ethan entering the school grounds. Suddenly, he halted mid-step, confusion and hurt visibly etched across his face. Students who once admired him hurried past, avoiding his gaze. Their heads bowed low. Ethan stood motionless, gripping his stack of papers tightly, his expression blank and disbelieving, as if unable to process the rapid unraveling of his reputation. At that moment, I felt as though I were watching the perfect scene unfold, an idealistic teacher betrayed utterly by the very community he trusted. Smiling quietly to myself, I reached over and drew the blinds closed, savoring the profound satisfaction of absolute power. Settling back into my chair, I leaned backward, closing my eyes briefly. In my mind, Ethan's helpless figure standing alone in the schoolyard was proof of a simple, undeniable truth. Morality, idealism, and honesty, Glossy, were nothing more than hollow illusions. The world belonged firmly to those like me, those who were patient, cunning, and adept at manipulating circumstances to achieve absolute control. And now, it was undeniably clear I was firmly in command of this narrative. Ethan was merely a supporting character, silenced completely within the script I had masterfully written. The pale morning light filtered weakly through the window, casting long shadows over the conference table in Principal Harris's office, where Ethan sat facing the administration. From my discreet vantage point in the hallway, I observed the meeting through the slightly open door, savoring every detail of Ethan's slow unraveling. Principal Harris sat with arms crossed, his expression cold and unyielding, his gaze piercing Ethan with quiet condemnation. "Mr. Reed, do you fully grasp the severity of these allegations against you? The rumors that you're deliberately undermining this school's reputation have spread rapidly, and they're quite troubling." Ethan leaned forward desperately, his voice trembling, edged with anguish. "Please believe me, I swear, none of this is true. I've never intended to harm the school's reputation. All I wanted was to improve this place." Vice Principal Andrews exchanged a discreet glance with Margaret Collins, their faces expressionless, distant, devoid of sympathy. Andrews shook his head gently. "I'm sorry, Ethan. Everything we've heard and observed seems to contradict your claims. Parents have been calling the school, concerned about your motives. Your colleagues have expressed serious doubts. How do you expect us to believe you? I don't even know what else I can do to convince you." Ethan's voice broke, his hands inadvertently loosening their grip. The document slipped from his grasp, scattering haphazardly across the floor. He quickly bent down, fumbling awkwardly to gather the scattered papers, his movements filled with palpable embarrassment and hopelessness. Watching him closely, I felt a quiet surge of cold satisfaction spread within me, savoring his despair with subtle pleasure. Principal Harris raised his hand, interrupting Ethan sharply and definitively. "Ethan, given the circumstances, we've decided to suspend you from your duties pending further investigation. We cannot risk the school's reputation and stability for the sake of one individual's claims." Ethan sat motionless, eyes wide and stunned, as though his entire world had abruptly collapsed. The administrators rose silently from their chairs, their gazes icy and dismissive as they moved past him, without a word of comfort or reassurance. Ethan remained seated alone, shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of his newfound isolation. Eventually, Ethan stood up slowly and walked out into the hallway, moving past me without seeming to notice anyone around him. His steps were hesitant, his gaze blank and utterly defeated. I watched his retreating figure until he disappeared from sight, a satisfied smile quietly forming on my lips. "Do you finally understand, Ethan?" I mused silently. "Your naive ideals and moral righteousness were never a match for real power and pragmatic control." Returning calmly to my office, I closed the door gently behind me, savoring the satisfying pulse of power surging through me. This world had never belonged to idealists like Ethan. It belonged solely to those who knew how to control the game. Today, I had proven once again who the true master of this game was. That afternoon, the sky was overcast, mirroring perfectly the somber mood enveloping Ethan's quiet departure. From my office window, I watched him methodically pack away his remaining possessions into a small cardboard box. His movements were slow, mechanical, devoid of the enthusiasm and purpose he once carried so proudly. No colleagues approached him. No farewells or comforting words were offered. Instead, they deliberately averted their eyes, as if Ethan's very presence had become taboo. As Ethan stepped out into the hallway, an uncomfortable silence fell instantly, thick enough to suffocate. A group of students, some of whom had admired and cherished him just weeks before, walked hurriedly past, heads bowed and eyes fixed downward, pretending not to recognize their former teacher. I noticed Ethan pause briefly, his expression visibly wounded by this blatant rejection from those he had sincerely cared for. When Ethan reached the school's front gates, he hesitated for a moment, as though silently wrestling with himself. Then, slowly, he turned back to cast a final glance at the building behind him. In that brief instant, his gaze betrayed a depth of bitterness, disappointment, and regret that only one who has completely lost faith in their ideals can possess. From where I stood, a deep sense of satisfaction blossomed within me. I felt no remorse whatsoever. Instead, I was quietly proud of my skillful manipulation and strategic patience. Ethan's critical mistake had been his naive belief that honesty and idealism could ever triumph over calculated pragmatism and real power. Just moments after Ethan disappeared from sight, I calmly returned to the teacher's lounge. Margaret Collins stood by the faculty mailboxes, removing Ethan's nameplate with casual indifference, dropping it directly into the trash bin. Nearby, colleagues nodded approvingly, quickly resuming their mundane conversations, as if Ethan had never existed. Settling comfortably into my desk chair, I opened my notebook with unhurried calmness, savoring every moment of my complete and undeniable victory. The world had never been meant for idealists like Ethan. It belonged solely to those cunning enough, cold enough, and powerful enough to manipulate their circumstances to perfection. And now, Ethan Reed was officially reduced to a faint memory, a vivid testament to the undeniable strength of power, strategy, and manipulation that I had always embodied. In this carefully orchestrated game, I was and always would be the last man standing. Barely 2 weeks after Ethan's quiet departure, I stood proudly at the center of Woodrow Prep's main auditorium, bathed in the warm glow of spotlights during the annual recognition ceremony. Colleagues, parents, and students packed the hall, their gazes directed toward me with unmistakable admiration and respect. Principal Harris stepped confidently to the microphone, his voice brimming with pride. Today, we gather to honor an individual whose unwavering commitment safeguarded the stability and reputation of our beloved institution, especially during recent challenging times. Please join me in congratulating Mr. Robert Stanton on his promotion to vice principal for his outstanding contributions. Thunderous applause erupted from the crowd. I walked steadily onto the stage, a composed, self-assured smile fixed on my face. As I accepted the certificate from Principal Harris, my eyes briefly wandered across the audience, momentarily landing on the empty seat Ethan once regularly occupied during faculty meetings. That vacant chair filled me with a heightened sense of triumph. The one man who had dared to challenge my authority was now utterly erased from existence. Stepping toward the microphone, I addressed the audience confidently. I am deeply honored by this opportunity to serve our school community in a greater capacity. This isn't just my personal achievement. This is proof of our collective dedication to protecting Woodrow Prep's cherished stability and prestigious reputation. Another vigorous round of applause followed my words. At the front of the auditorium, a small group of students looked up at me, their eyes wide with admiration as they whispered enthusiastically to one another. "Mr. Stanton is incredible. He always knows exactly how to protect our school." Their genuine admiration deepened my sense of satisfaction, reaffirming my masterful ability to manipulate circumstances perfectly. As the ceremony concluded, I stepped down from the stage and was swiftly surrounded by colleagues and parents offering heartfelt congratulations and praise. Throughout these interactions, not a single person mentioned Ethan as though his existence had simply vanished from collective memory. Back in my spacious new office, I sank into the comfortable leather chair, turning slowly to gaze thoughtfully out the large window behind my desk. In the solitude of that moment, I fully allowed myself to savor this victory. A sharp, decisive thought echoed clearly in my mind. Truth and justice mean absolutely nothing without power. Only those who control the game truly reap its rewards. I closed my eyes briefly, smiling subtly to myself, savoring the profound sense of satisfaction. Ethan had once believed morality and integrity were humanity's greatest strengths. Yet now he was utterly defeated, while I reveled in absolute, albeit false glory, in this ruthless game of influence and power. Ultimately, I was and would always remain the winner. Several months had passed since the memorable award ceremony, and my life at Woodrow Prep had become increasingly comfortable, my influence firmly established. The spacious office, newfound authority, and daily affirmations of respect and admiration made Ethan nothing more than a distant memory. In fact, I had nearly forgotten him entirely, until an unexpected conversation brought his name abruptly back into my thoughts. It happened on an ordinary Monday morning, as I entered the teacher's lounge, coffee cup in hand. I overheard Margaret Collins quietly speaking with one of our newer teachers. At first, I barely paid attention to their muted voices, until a familiar name caught my ear, halting my steps immediately. "Did you ever know Ethan Reed?" the young teacher asked softly. Margaret sighed slightly, her voice tinged with pity and hesitation. "Yes, unfortunately I did. Last I heard, he moved to some remote town up north. Apparently, he's struggling quite badly. He can't even land a decent job in education anymore." The younger teacher sounded genuinely surprised, questioning further why I'd heard he was a really passionate and idealistic teacher. Margaret lowered her voice further, shaking her head sadly. "Idealism can become a liability. Ethan made some serious mistakes here, created some problems he couldn't fix. After everything, it's not surprising no one will take a chance on him now. A mutual friend told me he's been working part-time in some small store, barely scraping by." Listening to this exchange, subtle smile crept onto my lips. I took a leisurely sip of my coffee, savoring not only the taste but also the deep satisfaction that settled within me. I felt not even a shred of remorse or pity for Ethan. On the contrary, I was quietly pleased, convinced that he deserved every hardship he'd encountered. The world never rewarded naive idealists who lacked a realistic grasp of power and pragmatism. Returning to my spacious, well-appointed office, I sank into my leather chair, gazing thoughtfully around the comfortable surroundings I'd earned through strategic calculation. My thoughts drifted briefly toward Ethan, and I wondered, with faint amusement, what meaningless task he might be performing at that very moment, living a life far removed from anything he'd ever envisioned for himself. I questioned briefly if Ethan had finally recognized his fatal error, his blind devotion to abstract principles of truth and morality, while disregarding the concrete realities of influence and authority. Those like Ethan would forever remain outsiders, never fully comprehending why they always ended up defeated. Turning on my computer, I opened my emails to find several messages from parents and administrators congratulating me on the school's latest achievements. Achievements now directly linked to my guidance and leadership. These accolades further reinforced my conviction about the life choices I'd made. Power, pragmatism, and strategic control had consistently led me toward success. A success that Ethan and his misguided peers could never attain. Sunlight streamed through the large office window, illuminating the room in a warm, comforting glow, accentuating the impressive environment I now occupied. Leaning back comfortably, I allowed myself to fully embrace the gratifying sense of victory. Ethan Reed had not been the first person I'd defeated in this harsh game of influence, and certainly would not be the last. Settling deeper into my chair, a sharp and familiar thought crystallized clearly in my mind, a philosophy I'd long adopted as my own guiding principle. This world has no place for naive idealists. True victory belongs only to those who grasp power firmly and know precisely how to wield it. Ethan failed because he chose the wrong battle from the beginning. I smiled contentedly, utterly satisfied in the profound echoes of my triumph, fully assured that in this relentless game, I was and always would be the last one standing. Thank you all for watching this video. Please comment and let me know what you think about this story. Please like and subscribe to watch more great content on my channel.